So, Clarke Jarrett, Director of Special Projects at AHNA Group, but I actually used to do Dominic's job, so I was former commander of SO15, which you might tell from my suit, because if I was wearing a white shirt, you might think we are one and the same almost. But Dominic, thank you for a really interesting insight into your world. So, Director of Special Projects, and the title there, Insider Risk and People Issues. So, talking to the group here, I'm not going to labour on too much about insider risk and what it means. I will put the definitions later. But what do I mean when I talk about people issues? So what I want to do here is try and sort of bring today together and maybe give a different perspective on what you've heard, and hopefully a slightly newer perspective that will help you in your roles as security consultants. What do I mean by people issues? I'm going to be talking about things like emotional well-being, emotional intelligence, stress, mental health, engagement and disengagement in the workplace, and quiet quitting, all of which are insider threats. And they're also threats which are growing, but they're not normally managed by people like yourself. They're managed by HR managers, they're managed by line managers, they're managed by conduct and culture strategies within big companies. Now, I'm not saying that's the wrong place for them, that's absolutely the right place they should be managed. But what I'm seeing in the companies we're engaged with, those people in those strategies are not talking to each other. And even where companies have an insider threat strategy, they're not talking enough to HR. They're not talking enough to culture and conduct colleagues. So that's the sort of perspective I want to talk about today, and to give you an insight into the work we've done around this. I also want to talk about why people factors are so much more important than people think to insider threat. They impact insider threat greatly, and I'll give some examples here today, but they also impact performance of companies. Now, we all know companies are there to make money, to make profits, to succeed, and that's where, if you can tackle the insider people issues, you can improve profits, profitability, and then you can turn your work in security into a real benefit to companies. So I hope to give you some insight into how you can use people issues in your work, tie them together with all the technical stuff we heard earlier to protect your companies, their reputations, and prevent insider threats. So some of the themes I'll talk about today, we'll talk about the current insider risk being the narrative being far too narrow. I'll expand on this, but basically, people talk about insider risk in companies and in government, and it's really focused on the high-end threats far too much, when I think it's much more based in the people issues. So I'll talk about that. And because of that, many companies do absolutely nothing about insider risk, because for them, it's not a real threat. Many medium to small companies don't think it's an issue for them, or it's not an issue they can tackle. I'll talk about why all companies actually need an insider threat strategy and how it can really help them. They need a proportionate strategy for their work and the size of the company, and how more focus on people issues is needed. I'll also give you some guidance that is some really good reference documents out there and websites you can use, and also talk about some technology which we've developed at AHNA Group, which you can use to absolutely and directly help reduce insider risk. So, insider risk, insider threat, two separate things. And this is the National Protective Security Authority's definitions from last year, their most recent definitions. I won't read them out to you, you're all in the security industry, but I've highlighted in each harm and loss. That is what the National Protective Security Authority describe insiders as, people who will or aim to cause harm and loss. Doesn't describe really what harm and loss is, but people who damage organisations, whether they damage profits, reputation or performance. Now, I touched on just a few moments ago my view that it's far too CISO focused. Now, I did a search on Google preparing for talking to this group here, and these were some of the top searches that came up on Google in search on what's insider threat. In Perva 22, insiders caused 60% of data losses. Employers are a bigger risk than hackers. The average cost of a cyber incident is $4.45 million from IBM. And interestingly, the one at the bottom is from the UK's National Protective Security Agency, and that's a sponsored link at the top of Google when you search on insider risk. But what it says is that it talks about a data leak, it talks about an information leak. So this is where my view on the narrative is. It's far too focused on that type of work. Now I will repeat this thing, this is not wrong. We absolutely should be focusing on these threats, but they're not the only threats, and they're not the growing threats in the workforce. So what is the perception, in my view, of insider threats, and why does that turn some companies off? Information leaks, industrial espionage, assisting cyber attackers, driven by organised criminality, spying, state-sponsored attacks, and data breaches. Now, some of you may disagree, but that's what I think people in the public and in lots of companies that aren't security professionals see as insider risks. And here's some really good examples, and Dom helpfully touched on some of these. Top right, picture of David Smith, a Brit, convicted by SO15 for spying for Russia in Berlin. Cyber News reporting on the mother of all breaches, 26 billion records lost. And on the left, two British men, Christopher Cash, Christopher Berry, charged, links to our government spying for China. There's some other data around tech leaks and CISO Online, 15 biggest data breaches listed. But if you think about what this means to companies, this is not the experience of many of your customers. They will need cybersecurity, but they don't see themselves as targets of this threat. But they are going to be targets or victims of human issues within their companies. So this means there's a significant gap in coverage where you can all help as consultants. Digitalization World, very tech-focused website and magazine, estimates that 70% of organizations in EMEA do not have an insider strategy. Now, because they're a tech focus, I think that's probably much, much higher. So very few companies have an insider threat strategy. That means there are millions of companies that do nothing. The ones that do probably focus on the cyber end. The big companies, especially the ones that we've worked with, that do have an insider threat plan or strategy, they're very siloed and they're not talking to the other parts of the companies that deal with those human issues I mentioned at the beginning. So again, this means a significant opportunity for consultants. So why are the people issues really important in insider threat? This is a picture I used for an article on LinkedIn about insider threat. And the problem with dealing with insider threats is companies are dealing with the symptoms and the behaviors and not the causes. Now, this is not new. I come from a policing background, 32 years of police experience. Policing deals in the main with behaviors and symptoms. It doesn't treat the causes. Policing investigates terrorism, investigates robbery, theft, murder, but it doesn't treat why people do those things. It doesn't treat people's emotional intelligence, poverty, mental health, stress. It doesn't treat education, emotional well-being. Now, I don't think policing can or should tackle those things. But if you think about the way policing and security often works, it treats those symptoms. It's a bit like treating a heart attack with a painkiller. It's never going to cure heart disease. It's just going to make you feel better for a very short time. And in simple terms, that's what a lot of insider threat plans in companies are doing. They're treating the behaviors and the symptoms. So they're managing data access, data storage, data access to buildings, cybersecurity, the monitoring communications. But they're not treating the reasons why people in their organizations do bad or stupid things. Now, I just want to give you a bit of context about sort of my background and interest in this topic. I was fortunate enough for 2 years feels like a long time ago to study criminology at Cambridge, and I wanted as my thesis to study insider threat. It was all called insider threat, then there wasn't such thing really as insider risk, it was just insider threat. But there wasn't enough data, there wasn't enough research on the topic. And you know, the seniors on the course said, there's no research here, you can't really pull together a meaningful thesis. At that time, I was just finished working on the London Olympic project. I was working as Chief of Staff for Cressida Dick, who was then the UK's head of counter-terrorism and protection. And after working with her, I moved into counter-terrorism. And very much like Dom described then, I got an awareness of dealing with Official Secrets Act investigations, dealing with the high-end, tip-of-the-spear sort of Official Secrets Act investigations. Also in counter-terrorism policing, I worked with the prevent strategy. Now, Dominic talked about the prevent strategy, and it is one of the few areas where government, policing, and partners join together to really treat those causes about why people are being radicalised. Saw the benefits of that work. I was in the Counter-Terrorism Command right through 2013 to 2020, and with Dean there and Dominic, we all worked on the terror attacks in London from 2017 and onwards, from the first one being the Westminster Parliament attack, Borough Market, assisting on Salisbury and Manchester. Now, again, as Dominic mentioned, big command, 2,000 people who were busy with all their usual investigations and preventing terrorism. On top of that came some really big investigations which created a lot more work and meant the staff were dealing with a lot more victims, a lot more families. And we started to see as a command our people creaking. Their emotional well-being was being damaged, they were under stress, they weren't performing, and they were making bad decisions. So in the command, we ran a campaign, it was an emotional well-being campaign, saying to the team, it's okay not to be okay. Talk about these issues. And we had a really great day, County Hall over the river. We actually got Prince Harry to speak to most of the command, and he did an amazing job being really honest, speaking to the command about his experiences. Signposted the teams the things they could do to help themselves. But what I realised, speaking to some mental health professionals, was that this meant the team or the team member had to put their hand up and say, I'm struggling, I need help. There was no way for me, leading a command, where I could measure the emotional well-being of the people in it and support them properly and find out where there was stress, find out the people who maybe didn't know they were struggling, that they really were. And at that point, I was lucky enough to be introduced to a company called CCR3 in Scotland. And CCR3 were doing some cutting-edge work with one of the world's biggest tech companies. Now, they weren't doing it with them, they were doing it for the tech company. So CCR3 were for this enormous tech company, worldwide name, were designing a system to measure emotional well-being and safety of the staff they employ, before they employed and whilst they were in. I thought this work was incredible, and it's based on science and it's being tested. So I kept in touch with CCR3 and assisted them on some of their development. In 2023, I joined AHNA Group, and then AHNA Group partnered with CCR3, and we started to jointly develop this solution to measure the risk someone poses and their emotional well-being. And we launched that product in February. It's called Thea. It's unique technology, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but it's a tool that companies and consultants can really use as a game changer to help those people issues in a company. I want to give us a bit of background as to sort of my interest and focus on this. So I've talked about people factors. I've given you my view on maybe the slightly skewed focus on insider threat. But what do others say? So the US National Insider Threat Task Force talks there about insiders who harm themselves or others or damage organisations often display concerning behaviours resulting from a combination of personal predispositions and a lack of emotional resilience to cope. That's down to things like burnout, stress, etc. And then an interesting quote from Emma Walcott, head of reputation protection at Michigan DeRay, one of London's most expensive lawyers, talking about the fact that businesses need to look inwards to things that will actually damage them. So how do these people issues manifest within the companies you're going to be working with? People become bullied or they become bullies. They become involved in harassment, toxic culture, poor performance, workplace violence and stress, all wrapped up in that emotional well-being crisis. Now, we talked about harm or loss in the definition from the National Protective Security Agency. The harm or loss to companies because of these things is enormous. They aren't covered by traditional insider strategies. Most companies, as I've said, don't even have one. They cost billions to deal with. They're dealt with by HR, and they're high volume. They damage companies and reputations. But also, people from that left-hand box can go from a sort of military term, from flash to bang, really quickly, from something which is quite innocuous to something quite tragic. From HR to high harm. These are two extreme cases, but they're both people that were managed by their line manager and HR departments. They didn't join their organisations to cause damage. They evolved into causing damage because they maybe weren't looked after or they couldn't cope. So Nidal Hassan, 2009, killed 13 colleagues and injured many more in Fort Hood in the US. Hassan was isolated, stressed, agitated, described as a poor performer. Chelsea Manning, which many of you will be very aware of, a year later, 2010, leaked 750,000 highly sensitive US documents to WikiLeaks. Manning was being bullied in a well-being crisis, was identified as a poor performer and being managed. But the dots weren't joined up, even in the organisations they were working in, that they were a risk, as an insider risk. Talking about high harm, here are people that have absolutely murdered people and ripped families apart. Wayne Couzens, police officer, rapist, murderer. Couzens had applied and given misleading job applications to a number of police services and not being picked up or joined up. He had spiralling debt pressures, which his employers were aware of. He was a poor performer, high sickness rates, and a work-life stress balance, travelling too far, 2.5 hours travelling a day. His line manager was aware of the problems this was causing him, as well as a sexual offending history, again, which wasn't really dealt with well or picked up. Lucy Letby murdered 7 babies, had been reported by colleagues for poor performance, had been suspended, was being dealt with by HR. And your bottom left, Andreas Lutz, German Wings flight 9525, 2015, crashed his plane to the Alps, killing 150 people. Now, he was described as depressed, burnt out, fearful of losing his job because his eyesight was failing, and was really well known to HR and the medical teams at German Wings. Now, they are extreme examples, but they are absolutely insider threats, but they're not people that we picked up in most strategies. So what is the scale of insider threat and risk? I don't think anybody knows. There's a completely weak evidence base. What's out there is cyber focus, and there's a lack of reporting. It's too broad to measure. But I think it's really interesting. All the research suggests the problems are growing, and this is a really, really important point for you as consultants. This problem is only going to grow. So, research on insider risk and the people issues. Gallup 2003 report, 53% of the global workforce is quiet quitting. Deloitte's Global Capital Human report this year, nearly half of millennial Gen Zs feel stressed out most or all of the time. UK Centre for Mental Health last year, Britain's mental health is getting worse, and The Lancet reported this year the spiral in demand for mental health services. So workers are in a worse condition than ever, which only increases the likelihood of insider threats. This results in the crisis I've talked about. There's post-COVID resentment about actually working with some groups. There's a values clash with what people want from work and what their employers want. And there are growing mental health issues. This leads to active disengagement within the workplace, poor performance, poor attendance, violence and toxicity, quiet quitting, and the flight or fight response, which you all know makes people do things they wouldn't maybe normally. The top one on the right, active disengagement, I think is really interesting. Here's a slide of research from Gallup on worker engagement globally. Now I'll talk you through this because it's not easy to pick out just as it is there, but each line is at volume. So the top line, the purple line, is the bulk of a workforce, of workers. And the purple line are the passively engaged. That's the majority of people becoming passively engaged with their job. They turn up, they do a reasonable job, they're not stars, they're not being managed for poor performance, they're just getting along. That's the bulk of employees. You look in there between 60 and 70% of the workforce are in that category. The light blue line, the second highest level, are the passively disengaged. That's growing. They don't really care about their job. They turn up and they do the minimum. And I think we all know people in our organisations or in organisations we've been in like this. They are really the dead wood. Probably need to go, but they're not bad enough to get rid of, especially in big organisations. The grey line, now these are the stars. They're the actively engaged people. They're the people that you really want in your companies. It's only about 20 to 30% of the staff, but they're excellent. They make the difference. They're the future. But you can see at the end, the number of those people are dropping. And the bottom red line is the actively disengaged people. These are the people that are actually insider threats. They want to harm their companies. They want to do the least. They want to make mischief. Those numbers are growing. And as this, I think, was a 2022 survey, we may already have more actively disengaged than engaged people in companies, which again, huge issue for employers. So what guidance is there to deal with this growing human issue threat to companies? Well, interestingly, it comes, a lot of it, and the sort of really good guidance comes from the USA. And their National Insider Threat Task Force was set up after the Hassan and Manning incidents. And they've got what I think is a really good sort of mantra of from report to support. A lot of people don't join companies to be insider threats. It happens to them. And I think the comment at the bottom from Rebecca Morgan is really, really helpful, talking about how this impacts people. I said I'd talk about actual guidance that could help. ASIS did a really helpful article 2021 on the report to support program in the US. It's a really good read. Boundless HR 2024 report from Deloitte is excellent. Talks about the challenge of recruitment, retention, workforce dynamics that all impact insider threat. The UK's NPSA, excellent guidance on insider threat. And it does touch on joining up with the human issues, but not as well, I think, as the American model. Within the NPSA is HOMA, which is, again, really detailed, great guidance for consultants and companies. And I've touched on the American National Insider Threat Task Force. So what can you do to assist? What are we doing at AHNA to assist companies? Now, as I've said, these people issues won't be dealt with purely insider risk strategies. But there is real value in understanding them, the people issues, and helping companies join up their strategies. And it needs to be proportionate. Not all companies are going to need all these strategies. But if they're aware of the crossovers and they're brought together and communicate, you can actually have a much bigger impact on insider threat and risk in a company. So where companies have culture and conduct, performance, HR, recruitment, insider risk and cybersecurity, bring them together or bring in the parts they haven't got and still need. This gives each company a proportionate and flexible approach. And key point here, changes security from a cost to an investment. If you can show a company you can help them perform better, that brings real value to your offerings to them. And use technology. Recruit better staff. I've talked about our tool and I'll show you some pictures of that later. Recruit better staff, safer staff, more emotionally resilient staff into an organisation. Or measure, because we can now, where I couldn't back in 2019, measure the team's emotional well-being. Identify the hotspots. Identify the people that maybe don't know they're crumbling. All reduces risk. So when I talk about technology, I suppose I should say there are other technology providers available, but there aren't because this is quite unique. So we released Thea, as I said, in February. Online assessment, very simple to take, takes 20 minutes, has no bias in it. And we're working with companies now who are using Thea to pre-assess people who join, to identify risks they may pose because their thinking is unbalanced and they operate well outside the norms of rational thinking, measuring their well-being. So you bring in safer people. We're also using Thea in companies, as I mentioned, to measure emotional well-being, to look after people so they don't go on a slippery slope to doing things they would never normally do. And you can see here at the top, you have a Thea gauge, which really talks about risk. The further you are to the red, that person's not in a good place. You have an aptitude score, which gives some skills, emotional well-being score and emotional resilience score. In what sort of place is that person and how can they keep, and will they keep on coping? These are now mathematical, scientific scores we can give people. And companies are getting really excited about what this can offer to them. So hopefully what I've done today is maybe given a slightly different view of insider threat and risk. Maybe give some extra ideas of how you can tackle that and how you can support companies. And also highlighted some technology that I think could be a huge help to you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.